of reason, Thune continuing, I'm concerned about who's going to be in the president's ear, unquote. This underlines one of the more important points about the veritable cavalcade of White House and Trump administration departure that we've seen almost ever since Mr. Trump took office. It's not just the number of departures that is so jarring, although the sheer volume is quite astounding. It's also the reasoning behind all of these exits, highlighting substantive issues, whether related to ethics or lack thereof, or the Russia investigation, or anything else. Reasons that help explain why the president's approval rating is historically low. The first major departure was National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who was fired after he lied to the FBI and to the vice president about his contacts with the Russian ambassador. And lest we forget, the fired FBI director, James Comey, who has said the president asked him for his personal loyalty and to take it easy on Flynn. Now, the president denied that, but did say he was thinking of the Russia investigation when he decided to send Comey packing. K.T. McFarland was Michael Flynn's deputy after a new national security advisor, General H.R. McMaster, came on board replacing Flynn. McFarland was nominated to be ambassador to Singapore. During confirmation hearings, however, she had been asked about communications between the Russian ambassador and her former boss, Mike Flynn, and she responded, quote, I am not aware of any of the issues or events described. An email obtained by the New York Times called that into question, and the Senate put a hold on her nomination until she further explained her name was soon withdrawn from contention. Scandal has seemed to play a role in other departures as well. Last week, after a marathon testimony before the House Intelligence Committee for their Russia probe, top aide Hope Hicks announced her resignation, a surprise to many since she's one of the president's closest confidants. Her exit also came after the departure of Rob Porter, the White House staff secretary to whom she's been romantically linked. He was fired after past allegations of domestic violence against him were publicly revealed. Turbulence and chaos has marked the Trump administration. Press Secretary Sean Spicer headed for the door in July after Anthony Scaramucci was named as the new White House communications director, a move Spicer adamantly opposed. The mooch also helped get rid of Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, but it was only 11 days into his time at the White House that Scaramucci was fired himself by John Kelly on his first day as Chief of Staff, following some rather colorful commentary to The New Yorker. Scaramucci's departure was followed soon after by Steve Bannon, the nationalist id of the president's campaign. Shortly thereafter, Sebastian Gorka, also ignominiously fired, said in his resignation letter obtained by the Federalist that, quote, forces that do not support the MAGA promise are for now ascendant within the White House. Kelly also showed the door to Omarosa Manigault Newman, who soon showed up on Celebrity Big Brother. And don't forget those pesky ethics questions that have also dodged some members of the administration. Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price resigning after his use of private jets for government travel emerged. CDC Director Brenda Fitzgerald quitting after it was revealed she bought tobacco stock. Then, of course, there are the numerous allegations of racist, homophobic, or otherwise inappropriate comments made by those nominated or serving in their Trump administration roles, many of which were brought to light by CNN's K-File team, also leading to a slew of departure. This list of departures, which, by the way, is not even close to comprehensive, we still don't know who might be next voted off the island. H.R. McMaster, perhaps, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who reportedly called the president a moron, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who basically dared the president to fire him last week about the Russia probe, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, also in hot water over the Russia probe, as is FBI Director Christopher Wray, Presidential son-in-law Jared Kushner, who's been under scrutiny for security and ethical concerns, and, of course, the Chief of Staff, the one allegedly bringing order to the White House, John Kelly. So, in context, as you pour out a cold one for your homie, Gary Cohn, your Comey, who almost left once before, by the way, after President Trump claimed there were very fine people marching alongside the Klansmen and Nazis in Charlottesville. While you pour out your cold one for Gary Cohn, keep in mind that what matters just as much as who is leaving is why they're leaving. We'll be right back.
This is an intense place, as every White House, and it's not abnormal that you would have people come and go, but we're continuing to do great work. We're continuing to focus on the president's agenda, and that's what we're all here to do.
White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders this afternoon on staffing churn at the White House. So far, the Trump administration has had higher staff turnover than any of the previous 5 administrations, according to the Brookings Institution. We're back with our politics lead and my panel. So the president, Simone, has defended his style of management, saying that he likes conflict. There's nothing wrong with a little conflict.
There is nothing wrong with a little conflict, Jake, but I think this White House is different. Look, and I think it's a black hole for moral character and leadership. Almost every single staffer in the West Wing is lawyered up. They don't trust each other. They don't trust what the president is saying. And why should they? Because something different comes out every single day. Look, this may be a reality TV president, and he may think that he is running a reality television show. But the difference is the ratings, which are our standing in the world, they have real consequences. This is
One of the problems here is the White House is getting hollowed out, and the number of people capable of doing things, doing real things, whether you agree or disagree ideologically, is getting smaller and smaller, and they seem unable to recruit new people to take these jobs. So the kind of mess-ups we've seen this past week, I think we're going to see over and over and over again.
I know you're not the biggest fan of Senator Chuck Schumer, but do you disagree with what he said?
Well, one of the things that was hammered into my head when I was working for Jim DeMint was that personnel is policy. And if you don't have great personnel, you are not going to have great policy. And so when you have a person like Gary Cohn, who has to work with this whole slew of questionable characters who are now, resigning because of ethical conflicts, all kinds of reasons, you have a few people who try to go to the administration because they believe they can exercise some influence over their area of expertise. That is the shred of, the hope that they're hanging onto. So when you wake up one morning and have your whole economic world thrown into shambles because of a tweet, what's the point in staying? You go.
And Jeffrey, Cohn had talked about leaving before, after the president seemed to make a moral equivalence between the neo-Nazis and the counter-protesters in Charlottesville.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm less sympathetic to Gary Cohn than many people. The idea that, he wants to take a great moral stand over aluminum, but he won't take a moral stand over racism, I don't think that speaks volumes about his character. But in terms of the substance, it matters. Personnel is policy. The fact that that he didn't quit over other, that matters. And I just think it's a, I know, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The fact that he couldn't get the tariff announcement out with people lined up to support it, by surprising the people on Capitol Hill, that the procedures matter. And the fact that he couldn't get his act together to release the tariffs in an intelligent way, that shows how when you don't have good staff, you can't get good results.
Simone, Gary Cohn is a former Goldman Sachs executive.
He was the best thing that ever happened to Goldman Sachs in the White House. Look,
I'll be okay.
Okay, he is the best thing that ever happened to them in the White House. Look, they got their tax cuts. The tax cut bill, which has now become law, which is, again, a tax cut for the wealthiest people in America, that codified the tax cuts in the law for the businesses and the companies, but the people have temporary tax cuts. So please miss me with this Gary Cohn was so just hurt and shaken by the fact that he couldn't take control of the tariffs, that he was gone. I really think that Gary Cohn was he wanted to be able to go back to his Goldman Sachs buddies and his folks on Wall Street, and he could not do that because he did not have a handle on what is going on, because nobody has a handle on what's happening in this West Wing.
And remember the campaign in 2016 where the then candidate Trump ripped Hillary Clinton to shreds because she gave speeches to Goldman Sachs.
Right.
That was so terrible. Goldman Sachs, what a force for evil. Gary Cohn, Steve Mnuchin,
Right.
The two most important economic policymakers are former senior officials, or were, at Goldman Sachs.
There is something to be said, though, about Gary Cohn thinking that these tariffs, aluminum and steel tariffs, are actually going to cause damage to the economy, and he doesn't want to be associated with it.
Yeah, and I'm actually very happy to see broader consensus in the media among Democrats that tariffs are bad policy, something that, Republicans have been saying for decades and still adhere to. But in the case of Gary Cohn, listen, he's going to be okay, but he had a lot of expertise. Usually the president does get the best people in the early years of his presidency. President Trump has exhausted a number of experts on year one. I think we all should be wary for the next wave of people who may be coming in, who may have another agenda, who may be looking to exploit that position, and our eyes should be wide open.
President Trump's lawyers are considering the possibility of special counsel Bob Mueller sitting down with the president. Among their negotiation points, according to the Wall Street Journal tonight, trying to force Mueller to end the Trump-related portion of his investigation within 60 days of the interview. Out front now, the White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Peter Nicholas, who broke the story, and former Assistant United States Attorney and former Associate Independent Counsel for the Whitewater investigation, Kim Whaley. Thanks very much to both of you. So, Peter, you're breaking this story. What else are you hearing from your sources?
Well, that this interview with Bob Mueller, the prospect of it has become something of a bargaining chip. And what's happening is President's lawyers know that it's something Bob Mueller wants, and they're trying to see if there could be some concessions that they can get in return. One would be to see if they can get a quick end to this investigation, maybe 60 days after the date of the interview. The other would be possibly limiting the scope of the testimony, so the president wouldn't necessarily have to answer wide-ranging questions that Bob Mueller might necessarily be interested in, but just answer some more general questions that might avoid a perjury trap, just focus on the firing of former FBI Director James Comey, to see if they can just keep that the questioning as limited as possible.
Right, and of course, you know, pretty impossible to think that could fully happen, considering they don't know exactly what Bob Mueller's looking at with the president's personal finances or whatever else it could be, in addition to obstruction of justice. Do they, though, Peter, from your reporting, realistically believe that Bob Mueller is going to say, okay, sure, I'll agree to wrap up the investigation to you in 60 days? Do they really think that's realistic?
Well, they think that they have some leverage here, Aaron, and the leverage would be that they can, if Bob Mueller were to subpoena the president, they could try to quash the subpoena. They could go to court and set in motion a legal process that by some estimates could take a year or two, ultimately wind up in the Supreme Court. So if Bob Mueller wants an interview, and he wants it quickly, perhaps he'll agree to some concessions. So that's the leverage that they have. The Trump people have, but we've also talked to some experts in this process who say, look, Bob Mueller is not necessarily going to agree, let the subject of an interview dictate terms. I mean, he's got his own agenda.
Right, right. All right, so stay with me, please. Kim, you know, if you were Bob Mueller, would you agree with to
I can imagine that a prosecutor would agree to arbitrarily and artificially end an investigation on a particular date. Now, we saw this in the Whitewater investigation, but that was when President Clinton was served with a subpoena and agreed in exchange for withdrawing the subpoena and voluntarily appearing before the grand jury to some terms. But that was after a 4-year investigation, and the circumstances were really different. It's hard to imagine that the Mueller team would be taking this seriously at this stage.
And I guess that's the question, is who's got more leverage? I mean, Kim, Trump's team is trying to move the goalpost here again because, you know, as Spears reporting, you know, you now have this negotiation going on. But Trump himself, obviously, when he's been given the chance, has tried to act like, I have no problem talking to Mueller and I don't need any preconditions. I mean, here he is just a few of the times.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to speak under oath to give your version of those events?
100%. I would love to do that, and I'd like to do it as soon as possible.
When will you
Good luck,
do it, Mr.
everybody.
President? Do you have a date set?
So here's the story.
Do you have a date set, Mr. President?
I don't know. No, I guess they're talking about 2 or 3 weeks, but I would love to do it.
Would you do it in person?
You know, again, I have to say, subject to my lawyers and all of that, but I would love to do it.
Kim, do you think an interview ends up happening or not?
I think that an interview will end up happening just because this is a very thorough team of investigators. Now, that being said, we have a president that is used to or has a pattern of flouting the rule of law or not following norms. So there's no way to anticipate how much difficulty this process is going to take. I mean, we also have this looming specter of potentially firing Mueller. We know that he suggested that to his White House counsel, and that would throw the country into a major crisis. So I think that possibility is something the Mueller team has to take seriously that the Whitewater investigation team did not have to think about.
Peter, what's your gut from talking to the sources that you've been talking to on the Trump side? Do they believe that an interview will happen? It's just,
they're divided. There are some lawyers on Trump team who really don't want to see an interview. I mean, they feel that this would set a dangerous precedent also for future presidents. That if Trump agrees to an interview, future presidents might be held to that same standard. So they're making that argument as well. And they also understand they have a client who can be kind of chatty, who doesn't necessarily color between the lines. And that could be problematic in an interview because it could present perhaps present perjury problems Mueller has shown that he's willing to bring perjury charges. But there are others on the Trump team who are more sanguine about the prospect of an interview and are willing to do it. And so they think that it's one way to shut down this, close this investigation out early. If an interview with Trump is the missing piece in the puzzle, why not provide it, give Mueller what he wants, and then have him move away from Trump?
And of course, that's been their hope, whether that happens or not. I mean, Kim, today there was a lot going on in Mueller land. A former campaign aide, Sam Nunberg, he spent roughly 6 hours testifying before Mueller's grand jury. Of course, we know he had adamantly said he would do no such thing. It would take 90 hours. Well, it didn't. It just took 6. He did not speak to the media afterwards. Was Mueller glad to have Nunberg there, or did Nunberg make today harder for himself after the debacle of earlier this week?
Well, what Nunberg did earlier this week was rather unprecedented, and I think most people watching understood that it was uncomfortable at best. So it's hard to say that it made it harder for Mueller. I mean, they know what they're doing, and they have a wide and broad investigation. And I think it's important to keep in mind, with respect to the president as well, that Mueller has the cards here. Mueller has the power of the subpoena behind him and the grand jury. And so even President Trump doesn't have a lot of cards to play in terms of stopping that. Sure, he can go to court, but I'm also a constitutional law professor, and frankly, I don't think that there is an argument, listen, you can't put a president ultimately before a grand jury for any reason.